Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves the chemical senses. Now, the chemical senses, not surprisingly, are senses that we use to sense chemicals. That's why I love psychology, because everything is named exactly what it is. Now, the technical term for these chemical senses are olfaction and gustation. Olfaction and gustation. Now, olfaction is better known as your sense of smell. Now, in smell, what you're doing is you're sensing chemicals in the air or in the environment. And the way we do that, of course, is through our olfactory sense, which is located in the top of our nose. Now, when we inhale air, what happens is air carrying these chemical particles goes into our nose, and the particles themselves wind up sticking to the inside of our nose. Now, you always have mucus in your nose. Always. Okay? In fact, if you don't have mucus in your nose, you may wind up losing your sense of smell, either temporarily, because you're in a very dry environment, for instance, or in some cases, there have been situations where people who've used nasal sprays to dry up the nasal passages have actually managed to somehow destroy their olfactory senses. But you inhale, and the chemicals that you're sensing stick to the mucus, and you have little olfactory cilia on the top of your nose that get the information and send it to the olfactory bulb that is right above your nose, whereupon it is then deciphered and decoded. It's part of the reason why your sense of smell is the only sense that doesn't go through the thalamus. It doesn't have to. It's right there. Now, one thing that's very interesting about the sense of smell is that we tend to think we have a very bad sense of smell, when in fact we don't. Human beings have fairly good senses of smell, as long as you're not a smoker. If you're a smoker, you pretty much kill your sense of smell and taste just right there. But we have pretty good senses of smell. What we tend to do, however, is compare ourselves like world champion smellers, which certainly a candidate would be your average dog. Most dogs, at least the ones that don't have smooshed in faces, the ones that have nice long noses, have very good senses of smell. Which is why, for instance, they can track one person through a crowd. Every individual person has their own particular odor. So you smell differently from everyone else around you. And I'm not talking about BO here, okay? I'm not talking about not bathing. I'm talking about your own personal scent made up from your genes, your immune system, your body. And so that's why dogs, for instance, can track a person. Now, people would not be able to track people. It is possible for one person to tell another one apart by smell, because we all do smell differently. I have 3 sisters. I used to be able to tell whose bedroom I went into, even if I was blindfolded, when we were children all living in the same house, by what it smelled like. And it wasn't that we were using different shampoos and deodorants and stuff. My parents had 4 kids. They bought in bulk. But my sisters all smelled differently. And I would know when I went into my room because I wouldn't smell anything. Because you can't really smell your own personal scent because you're constantly surrounded by it. And through a process of what's called habituation, you lose the ability to perceive it. You probably noticed this with smell. And also, by the way, with touch and hearing. And taste, they're saying now these days as well. But the only thing you might not be able to do this with is vision. But if you're in a room where there's a particular odor, generally over a period of a few minutes, you will lose your perception of that odor. Unless it changes, and then it'll come roaring back at you. That's called habituation. And it's what would prevent us from being able to track someone through the wilds, uh, because we have this habituation for a sense of smell. Dogs do not. Now, as I mentioned before, it is possible to completely lose your sense of smell. A lot of people, for instance, who have had head injuries will wind up losing their sense of smell. Now, the olfactory bulb is kind of perched on the bottom of the brain. It's in a very vulnerable spot. It's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, or in this case, it's caught between the brain and a very hard shelf of bone. And when someone has a head injury, very often what happens is their brain swells, and when the brain swells enough, it can crush that olfactory bulb. So people may have a bad head injury, perhaps even one bad enough to put them into a coma. They wake up, they've lost their sense of smell. That's called anosmia. If you've lost your sense of smell, technically you're anosmic. And it can really be a problem because our sense of smell can be very useful. For instance, it can tell us when something is burning or on fire. That's a very useful thing to know. But the other thing that smell is also involved in is our perception of food. And I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about something slightly different from our total perception of food, and that is what's called gustation. Now, gustation is our sense of taste. Okay? This, of course, is found in our mouth and our taste buds that are located on the tongue. And there are 5 basic tastes, according to most researchers these days. You will know the first 4. There's sweet, there's salty, there's sour, there's bitter. The 5th is one that's called umami, and it's described as like a meaty, brothy kind of taste. Actually, umami is the Japanese word for that kind of flavor, and it's generally considered to be another taste. Now, the thing is, though, if you think about it, when you taste food, there's a heck of a lot more to tasting food than just sweet and salty and sour and bitter. Much more than that. And that's because there's a difference between your perception of taste, or gustation, and your perception of flavor. When you taste food, there's more to it than just taste. In fact, there's more to it than just taste and smell. Although anybody who has temporarily or permanently lost their sense of smell realizes that without their sense of smell, they lose a lot of their perception of flavor. And that is indeed true. You don't have a sense of smell when it comes to flavor. In many ways, you're stuck with sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, and that gets pretty boring after a while. But there are other things that go into your perception of flavor. For instance, the appearance of the food. What the food looks like can basically feed into your perception of flavor. Researcher once decided to do a study looking at this. I've been tempted to do this with one of my face-to-face classes. Made a big batch of brownie mix, divided that batch into 2 smaller batches, so they were all from the same mixing batch. Okay? One batch of brownies was baked normally. They were put in a pan, they were baked in the oven, they were sliced into nice squares. The other batch was formed by hand very carefully into the shape of dog droppings, of dog poo, feces. Both were baked up and they were served to people. People didn't really want the feces brownies very much. They did not go very quickly. And when people were asked to try those brownies, they did, but remarked that they didn't taste particularly good. It was the exact same batch, but it looked like it was bad, and so that's how we perceive the flavor. So what something looks like can play a big role. Another thing that plays a big role is what it feels like in the mouth. Mouth feel is a very, very big deal. And if you don't believe me, have you ever been eating something that was supposed to be creamy and then it crunched all of a sudden? I mean, it could be something as innocuous as eating creamy peanut butter, and maybe that crunch came from a piece of peanut. But I will bet you that the instant that supposedly creamy food went crunch, you immediately spit it out, or just all of a sudden it tasted horrible. Not because the taste changed, but because creamy is not supposed to crunch. It's even worse to eat something that's supposed to be crunchy and find it has an unexpected creamy center to it. Okay, neither of those is a lot of fun. So what it looks like and what it feels like can play a role. It took me a very long time, for instance, to eat my first raw oyster. Because, and I apologize to those of you who love them, I look at a raw oyster and I'm thinking, that is not appealing. It looks like phlegm on a half shell. Okay, that's not appealing. And I gotta tell you, it didn't help when I put it into my mouth, because it felt like phlegm on a half shell. So definitely what food looks like, what it feels like can play a role. Learning can play a role. We tend to view foods that are not viewed as quote-unquote appropriate foods as not tasting good. They may be perfectly fine food, they may be very, very tasty and very wonderful, but if we've learned that that is not something that you eat, we're going to experience the flavor as something awful. It's part of the reason why sometimes parents don't tell children what are in certain foods, because they may eat the food with great relish and delight until they've learned what's in it, and then all of a sudden it doesn't taste good anymore. In the United States, for instance, there are foods that we eat that other cultures don't. We really like our beef and we really like our pork, but quite frankly, eating beef and pork offends a substantial proportion of the world that views the eating of beef and pork as either immoral or unclean or filthy, that sort of thing. On the other hand, we look at what other cultures eat and we are also a bit horrified. And sometimes, by the way, this cultural thing can happen within a country itself. I lived in Montana for a while, and I went to a festival celebrating what is known as the Rocky Mountain oyster, which is technically a calf testicle. And in fact, this was called the Testicle Festival. And so I went to the Testicle Festival and I ate a calf testicle. And if I hadn't known that was what it was, because it had been cleaned, it looked like a piece of very sort of thin fried chicken. And in fact, that's what it tastes like. The cliche in that case was true. So I wouldn't have known what it was. And knowing what it was, I wasn't too sure about the first few bites. But after that, I realized that there was nothing wrong. It actually tasted pretty good. Although I'm sure the breading and the ranch dressing helped. Uh, so in other cultures, people eat insects. Here in the United States, we don't tend to eat insects deliberately, even though insects can be a wonderful source of protein. They're low in fat. I mean, they could be very, very good. So they're everywhere, but we don't eat them. We don't eat dogs. We don't eat horses in this country. Even though the meat might taste perfectly wonderful, and I've had people tell me that both of those are actually really quite tasty. But I suspect if someone served me something and said, "Here, it's dog, what does it taste like?" I not only would think it tasted horrible, I would probably vomit soon afterwards. That's not biological, that's cultural, that's learned. Okay? But that can also affect flavor. Lastly, age can affect flavor. As we age, like everything else, our perception of flavor tends to kind of go to the wayside. And this is why, as people age very often, they eat food that is much more highly spiced than they did when they were children. And it also might be why children don't always like certain types of foods. For instance, children very often don't like green vegetables like broccoli. Well, broccoli has a bitter undertone to it. The older you are, the less you can actually taste that bitter undertone. And I suspect the butter and the cheese probably help. So children can taste it a lot, adults can't. This is why you don't see like 4-year-olds piling Tabasco sauce on everything they eat, because the food tastes quite good without all of that stuff on it. But adults may need to do that because otherwise it just doesn't taste like anything. So the chemical senses, they work with themselves, they relate to one another, and they all feed into our perception of flavor along with other things.